The chrome machine waited like an animal trained to hold its breath. Its casing reflected the lab in distorted arcs. Fluorescence, a poster with a gluey tear at one corner, the halo of a coffee mug. A narrow screen blinked an inviting pulse. Below it, a tiny shelf, no bigger than a paper bag, protruded like a windowsill. Samir edged forward until his breath fogged the metal. Dr. Lila Santos stood with her hands clasped behind her back, fingers worrying the seam of her lab coat. Her voice never hurried. It arranged facts with the care she used to pick apart puzzles. "This is the jar machine," she said. "It reads the neural and physiological signatures of an emotion, translates that pattern into a light algorithm, and stores the result as a jar on the shelf. Each jar is a digital container, visual, auditory, even olfactory if you enable the scent module. We can place feelings on a shelf without losing them." Ari's eyes moved across the machine like someone scanning a small, shy garden. They touched the edge of the shelf as if expecting a jar to warm to their palm. "Is it permanent?" Ari asked, voice low. A warm tenderness softened their question. They looked suddenly smaller under the machine's chrome glare. Lila shook her head. "No, temporary. The jars persist until someone opens them. The act of opening reconstitutes the stored pattern into experience. It can be played back, shared, even dampened or amplified, depending on the parameters." She tapped the screen, and a menu flickered up. Capture, catalog, release. The name, capture, made Samir grin like a kid who'd found a new game. "Can it make happy into blue, angry into red?" He lunged with questions, the kind that ran ahead of their answers. "What if I put curiosity in a jar?" Or he cut himself off with a laugh that carried equal parts awe and mischief. "Can we swap jars? Trade a bad morning for someone's calm?" Lila's calm did not crumble, but a thin line of warning threaded her words. Emotions are not coins. The jars preserve pattern, not moral currency. Swapping changes context. A jar opened in the wrong place can overwhelm. We must follow protocol. She pointed to a chart by the machine, filter ranges, ethical consent toggles, and a conspicuous red field labeled Containment Procedures. Her thumb lingered there. Ari watched the little shelf as it blinked, each blink a promise. A pale orb of green rose on the screen, then resolved into a translucent container humming with the sound of rain. Samir leaned in, eyes sparkling. Ari smiled, small and earnest, then reached out and closed their hand around the empty air where a jar might sit. "If someone opens a jar when they're not ready," Ari whispered, "what happens to what was in them?" The question hung between them, bright and fragile. Lila met their gaze, and for the first time the lab's silence felt less like restraint and more like an intake of breath before a plunge. "That's what we're here to find out," she said. Somewhere in the machine, a motor clicked into life, and the shelf blinked again, as if answering with a single, careful pulse. The room smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and metal. Fluorescent panels hummed overhead, the lamp beside the machine casting a soft, almost reverent glow across the table. Dr. Lila Santos unfolded a single sheet of paper with deliberate movements, the edges crisp against her fingertips. "Before anything else," she said, voice even as a practiced metronome, "we read the protocol aloud. Consent is informed here. Everyone hears the risks and the limits." She scanned the page, eyes moving with precision. The words lay flat but heavy. Containment procedures, emergency release, ethical oversight, and the clause everyone pretended wouldn't matter yet. The part about irrevocable transfer if a jar is opened by someone other than the volunteer. Her lips barely parted when she spoke each item, and the list took shape in the air like a rubric. Samir leaned forward on his heels, knees creaking. "What if it's a tiny accident?" he asked, half joke, all curiosity. He had a stack of plastic mock jars in front of him, clear and bulbous, a blue lid waiting for his fumbling hands. "There's no such thing here as tiny if it breaks containment," Dr. Santos said. She tapped the line about storage, each jar labeled, sealed, stored in an allocated slot. We treat every vessel as if it already holds someone's interior landscape. She slid a consent form across the table with clinical calm. At the bottom, a signature waited like an invitation. Sign if you agree to follow protocol and to allow the team to study your confirmations if needed. Ari's fingers hovered above the pen. Their voice was small but steady when they asked, "If I change my mind later, can I?" The rest of the question dissolved under the weight of the room. "You can reclaim your jars at any time," Dr. Santos answered. "Volunteers decide at retrieval. We only intervene for safety." That softened something in Ari. A line of color returned to their cheeks. Samir picked up a jar, thumb smoothing the glass. "Okay, practice run." He pulled a marker with a flourish, the cap snapping like a tiny gunshot. He wrote "Joy, Samir" in a looping hand that nearly slid off the curve. He giggled at the crooked letters, then tried again, more careful. The second label stuck straighter, proud and obedient. Ari watched the repetitive motion of Samir's pen, then turned to the shelf unit at the far wall. It held rows of shallow cubbies, each numbered. They paused before the third from the left, like someone choosing a seat in a crowded chapel. The space was small. The light brushed it differently. They reached in, fingers brushing the wood, feeling the quiet within. "I'll take this one," Ari said, voice barely above the hum. "It's close to the door. If anything goes wrong, I can get to it." Dr. Santos nodded, approving the selection with a scientist's economy. Proximity makes sense for volunteers who might need rapid retrieval. Remember, every jar is one emotion, one feeling per vessel, no mixing. Ari inhaled, then exhaled as if letting a secret go. "I promise to follow the rules," they said. Their hand found the pen and wrote their name on the consent line with a small, decisive stroke. Samir's grin softened at their seriousness. For a moment, the lab was suspended between a laugh and a vow, between curiosity and containment. The machine remained a quiet sentinel, its metal surfaces reflecting the trio back at themselves, three figures learning where to place the most fragile pieces of their inner lives. Ari sat back into the chair and let the cool leather press against the small of their back. The machine settled around them like a slow exhale, the soft tick of calibration, the low mechanical hum that filled the lab with a steady, almost maternal rhythm. They watched the lights along the arm of the device pulse in time, a strip of beetle green that brightened and dimmed as if breathing. "Remember the consent read through," Dr. Lila said, voice clinical but not unkind. She hovered near the console, tablet in hand, eyes steady. "You can stop at any time. You understand the storage parameters and retrieval protocol." Ari's throat tightened. They nodded, fingertips grazing the seam of the chair where hours of waiting had left an indentation. "I understand," they said, each word measured. "I want to." The rest of the sentence lodged against a sudden flutter of nerves. Guilt pricked at them for taking up space, for letting Dr. Lila and Samir rearrange their day around one of Ari's trembling experiments. Samir leaned against a bench with a grin plastered on like sunshine. "You'll be fine," he chirped, voice too bright to be entirely convincing. He had been a flurry all morning, juggling cables and jokes, but his eyes kept darting to Ari with genuine warmth. "Imagine it like a jar you can shake when you're having a bad day. Except you can put butterflies in it." Ari smiled, small and private. Butterflies, an image they'd liked since childhood, made the anxiety loosen at the edges. The hum deepened. A scent like ozone and warm paper rolled in the air, the machine ramping up to readiness. Dr. Lila annotated a few lines on her tablet, then looked up. "Consent confirmed. Initiating capture sequence when you give me the signal." They closed their eyes and inhaled, counting to 4. The chair pressed. The hum vibrated through their collarbone, and something inside Ari responded with a raw, wordless shiver. They had comforted so many others, held trembling hands, offered hot tea, mended frayed edges of panic, but confessing their own need felt like stepping into a bright room without a jacket. What if the jar couldn't hold all of it? What if the first time failed? Now, they whispered, then louder to steady themselves. Do it. Cool filaments traced the line of their temples. Light pooled in the center of the room, not harsh but honeyed, and from that luminescence, a glass jar coalesced in midair. It wore no lid yet. It hovered as if waiting for approval. Inside, motes of light gathered and took wing, thin, trembling shapes like tiny paper butterflies stitched from sunlight. They stirred and bumped gently against the glass, creating a hush of sound that was almost music. Ari reached out on impulse, breath fogging the rim. With a borrowed pen Samir offered, their hand wrote in small, careful strokes, "First day." The label stuck to the glass as if it had always belonged there. Dr. Lila let out a short, satisfied hum. Samir's grin softened into something dazzled and real. Around them, the lab exhaled. Ari felt weight lift, not gone but rearranged. A knot eased into a ribbon. Everyone smiled, tender, relieved, and in that shared light, Ari's chest felt a little lighter, like a person who had finally put down a heavy bag and realized their arms could move freely again. Ari had never thought of worry as something that could be packed away. It arrived like static at the base of their throat, small, insistent, 100 tiny alert lights blinking in a row. In the lab's hush, with the pale hum of refrigeration and the faint sweet tang of antiseptic, they followed Dr. Santos's instructions. The jar accepted the worry without drama. A soft pulse, then a smooth suction, and the glass filled with a pearled gray that shimmered like smoke in slow motion. When Dr. Santos sealed it, Ari felt the most peculiar absence, as if someone had lifted a weightless backpack from their chest. The tightness loosened enough to let their ribs expand. Breathing became deliberate and clean, like stepping outdoors after being crowded in a subway car. They closed their eyes and cataloged the subtle freedoms. The throat unfurled, their hands stopped needing to rub each other, their mind no longer rehearsed every awkward possibility. A small laugh escaped them, surprised and raw. "Good," Dr. Santos said, not unkindly. Her voice was the steady keel Ari had come to trust. It outlined procedure and consent with the clarity of someone protecting both data and people. "You remember, you can reclaim anything you store. You also have control over sharing. That's part of the protocol." Samir leaned in the doorway, backpack slung on one shoulder, grin quick like a light flicking on. His eyes went to the shelf where jars stood, lined like a library of sighs and sparks. "Do you have anything calm?" he asked, all curiosity and not much reserve. He had a midterm that afternoon, one of those tests that ate sleep, and his voice wavered for the first time in months. Ari hesitated, remembering the gray they had just made. Then they slid a jar forward, a low ocean blue glow that smelled faintly of linen and rain in memory, and handed it over. Samir's face softened as he cradled it, fingers warm against the glass. "Seriously, you'd lend me this?" he said. Gratitude and embarrassment mixed into a bright blush. "Only for the afternoon," Ari said. "You return it, okay?" "Protocol." "Protocol," Samir repeated, nodding with an exaggerated solemnity that made both of them smile. He pressed the cork to his chest for a moment, like a performer with a talisman, then left to confront the exam. Later, Dr. Santos brought 2 jars to the central table, a quicksilver streaked with impatience, and a deep, amber patience Ari had once labeled as resilience. Under her lamp, she tilted one into the other, slow and exact. Colors braided and bled, silver threading through amber, until the whole swirled into a new shade, something between thunder and honey. The air in the room changed. The mixture smelled like hot iron and citrus peel. "This is why consent matters," Dr. Santos said. Her hand hovered over the blended glass. "Emotions are not additive the way we imagine. They transform. When you loan a feeling, you alter both it and those who receive it." Ari watched the new color ripple and imagined the shelf of jars as a map of choices, each vessel altering the next. A thrill and a worry hummed together, exhilaration at the possibility of relief, and a growing question of what would happen when someone, somewhere, began uncorking these jars again. The wet hum of the refrigeration unit underscored the morning like an anxious insect. Dr. Lila Santos moved through the lab with the sure-footed authority of someone who had built the protocols she now read aloud. Her voice was steady, each word clipped to a precise meaning. Consent forms, 2 witnesses, the neutral room, the sealed field test. Around the stainless steel table, the team scribbled, folding themselves into the ritual. When she finished, she didn't release the quiet. "Before we begin," she said, and the room leaned in, "I arranged for someone to stop by." A small, deliberate scrape sounded as the door opened. The man who entered was shorter than anyone expected and smelled faintly of old books and mint. His hair was the color of rainwater. His face had the careful creases of someone who measured time and hypotheses. He carried nothing but a brass tin and the kind of eyes that had watched many mistakes happen and learned their contours. "I'm Conrad Hale," he announced, voice porous with age but bright in the consonants. He set the tin on the table as if it were both artifact and warning. "I worked on early containment protocols. I thought it might help for you to hear one of ours." Samir's hand shot up with the eagerness of a child reaching for a dropped coin. "What happened?" Conrad lifted the tin like a relic. "A jar, similar to those you're about to open. Not one of ours. Someone in another facility kept it longer than they were supposed to. Curiosity wore the seals thin. They didn't do the 2-witness check. They called it a curiosity test. No forms." He paused, and the lab inhaled with him. It was labeled simply, regret, condensed. They thought they understood what regret looked like. A gray, sinking ache. They thought it would be melancholic, educational. When they opened it, the air didn't fall. It rushed. It filled the corridor in one breath. Old photographs and the metallic tang of a hospital room and the sound of a child calling a name that wasn't there anymore. People didn't cry softly. They staggered, doubled over, some clutched their chests as if their ribs had been rearranged by memory. It was like someone had poured someone's entire life into the ventilation. Ari's fingers found the edge of the table and curled, their knuckles blanched. They glanced at Samir, who smiled too quickly, the grin failing to hide his thinning pulse. "So it overwhelmed them?" Conrad nodded slowly. "Emotions are not gentle tinctures. They're weather. Some jars contain drizzle, others contain storms. The point isn't to scare you, it's to remind you that consent must be informed and steady. People who think they'll be immune are the ones that break first." The room absorbed the story in a new key. Dr. Santos folded her hands, eyes hard with decisions that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with care. "Post an extra warning," she said to Samir, who already was standing. "Outside the neutral room. Make it bold. Tell them what could happen." Samir moved with a burst of energy. Tape and paper found, words written with a humorless neatness. Ari hovered near Conrad, voice small. Did they get help?" "They did," he said, "but not before the mistake taught us a policy." He looked at each of them, and the old kindness in him turned strict. "Treat the jars like weather forecasts. Don't open during storms. Respect the consent you asked for." When the new sign went up, black letters on bright yellow, its edges seemed to sharpen the air. It read in no uncertain terms, "Do not open alone." The lab looked different after that, not less curious, but more careful, as if curiosity itself had been given a leash. Ari was alone in the back aisle of the lab because sleep had not come easily. The fluorescent lights had been dimmed to a low hum. The jars along the shelves looked like a constellation of promises and regrets, each labeled in tidy script. Most were steady small suns behind glass. Then a single jar blinked. It was labeled Lonely. The label had been Ari's idea weeks ago, written in a looping hand that always betrayed a softness. Tonight the glass thinned into a pulse, a gentle inhalation of light, too deliberate to be an accident. Ari held their breath, felt the air in the room cool against skin, and the pulse expanded again, like a shy heart tapping the table. They reached out before thinking, fingers hovering above the cold glass without touching. The light was warmer than it looked, a pale amber that pooled at the bottom of the jar and climbed as if searching for company. For a moment, Ari wanted to scoot the jar to a quieter shelf, tuck it away where no one would be tempted to see its contents. They pictured the experiment logs, the careful consent forms, emotions, stored, cataloged, used. The jar looked less like an entry on a spreadsheet than like a small, blinking person. "You're up late," Samir said from the doorway, voice crackling with caffeine and curiosity. He stepped in, palms empty, grin impatient. "What is that, a disco lamp?" Ari almost smiled. It blinked. Samir leaned forward, studying the jar. Faulty sensor then. Maybe a loose circuit or... He waved a hand toward the equipment. "I'll check the monitor." He headed for the console, fingers flying. His laughter, when something amused him, usually softened the room, but tonight it felt like an attempt to push the strange back into the realm of the explainable. He tapped keys, pulled up status lines, brow furrowing when he didn't find the usual warning signals. "No anomaly here," he admitted. "Everything's reading normal." The jar pulsed again, then twice in a staccato that made Ari's throat tighten. Samir's shoulders pitched forward. "Okay, that's weirder." By morning, Dr. Lila Santos stood in the lab with a clipboard and a gravity that filled the aisles. Her presence smoothed the nervous energy. She moved as if each step had a purpose. She listened without interrupting, watched the jar until her face read into the situation, and then ordered, "Lock down the shelf. Run a full systems check. I want manual readings, thermal scans, everything. No one touches any of the jars until I say so." Technicians nodded and set to work with brisk efficiency. For an hour the blinking ceased. The jars were museum still, the lab, a quiet machinery of diagnostics. Ari felt relief, like a held breath released, and with it, a prickling unease, as if something had been put on mute rather than gone away. Late that afternoon, when the corridor lights angled long and gold through blinds, the lonely jar lit up again. Not a gentle ripple this time, but a clear, deliberate blink, like an insistence. Ari's hand went to the glass before anyone else moved, and the room tilted toward a decision that would not be postponed. The experiment had been under their hands from the beginning. Now, whatever they had unlocked in a jar was asking to be heard. Samir barely kept his elbows off the bench, the jar a pebble in his palm. It was smaller than the others, a sliver of glass with a silver cap and a label that read in tidy block letters, "Giggles, 0, 2 milliliters. He turned it over like a curious child with a new key. "Don't," Ari whispered, fingers curved around the rim of the work table as if holding Samir steady. Their voice was low and anxious and somehow layered with the soft-hearted concern that always preceded a comforting gesture. "Maybe let me..." Samir's grin was too quick to be measured. "Just a peek," he said, and the cap gave with a distracted pop under his thumb. The sound that breathed out was immediate, a high, tinkling cascade that filled the lab like wind through glass. Laughter, not the practiced chuckle of polite rooms, but a bubbling, uncomplicated child's laugh that made the fluorescence seem warmer. It ricocheted off stainless steel, pooled in the corners, and slid under the doors. Ari's shoulders loosened. They laughed, too, a surprised, fluttering sound that made their eyes shine. Even Dr. Lila Santos let a short, involuntary smile cross her face before she caught herself. "Control, please," she said, voice returning to its clinical register, but the tension that had sat behind her jaw a minute earlier thinned for a heartbeat. Nell Gray, seated by the plant window with a cup gone cold, put a hand to her mouth as if to taste the memory of a summer long past. Then a different click, harder, angrier, sharp in the air. Someone farther down the shelf unscrewed a jar stamped rage. The release was like a struck bell, Low, metallic, title. Voices that had been quiet and deliberate snapped like chords. The lab's careful hum ramped to a jagged tempo. Papers fluttered. Chairs scraped. 2 interns who'd been adjusting a sensor stood and faced one another with fingers pointing, mouths forming accusations before thought could anchor them. "This is negligence," one spat. "You never check the containment seals?" the other shot back. Dr. Santos's calm pivoted into command. "Lockdown protocol 2, she ordered, voice disciplined, and the security panel blinked red. "Full diagnostics. Seal every port." Nell rose slowly, palms flat on the counter. Her face was patient and hard-won. "Rage is useful," she said, almost to herself. "It tells you the boundary. If you let it tear the rest, you learn nothing." Her stubbornness steadied the air, but not enough to keep the edges from fraying. Ari moved between the arguing pair, gloved hands out, eyes moist. They began to speak in the low cadence they used when coaxing a frightened animal. "We can hear each other. We can—" Before the sentence finished, a third cap came off. The sorrow jar exhaled like rain. The sound was a long, slow cello note that sank into the floorboards and into the ribs. Something loosened inside everyone. Words collapsed into breath. Samir's head dropped. He swallowed loudly, as if trying to hold back the sea. Dr. Santos, who had been all procedure and steel, steadied herself on the console and let tears spill, quick and hot. The lab held its breath and then surrendered. Tears came for no reason and for many: regret, relief, the memory of someone gone. Ari's hands found Samir's and Nell's at once, bridging the space between professional caution and human need. Around them, machines continued their quiet work, logging metrics and alarms, but the human chorus swelled, soft, honest, unguarded. Dr. Santos's voice, when it rose again, was smaller but firmer. "Keep the equipment running," she ordered. "But be here with each other. We'll run diagnostics, yes, but first, let this happen." And so the lab, a place built for containment and measurement, convulsed and softened together. Laughter, anger, sorrow braided into a chaotic proof that feelings, once digitized and uncapped, refused neat order. Ari paused at the doorway, palm flat against the cool metal frame. The lab throbbed with an energy that made the fluorescent lights buzz. Laughter ricocheted against tile and steel, a high, bright sound that blurred into alarms. Vials of light, hazy, trembling, hovered in the air like blown glass. For a second, Ari's chest tightened with the familiar guilty knot. How much of this mess was theirs? Then they inhaled, slow and deliberate, and stepped forward. Lockdown. Dr. Santos barked without looking up, voice clipped and precise. Her command turned the chaos into a stricter current. Voices slowed. Someone dropped a cup. But beneath Lila's clinical control, something vulnerable trembled. She set her jaw and kept moving. Clipboard clutched, eyes flicking from jar to jar. Aerosolized curiosity glittered near the back table like confetti. Another jar seethed with a metallic taste that sparked the edges of nerves. Samir was perched on a stool, knees knocking, palms blank with nervous delight. He reached for a floating sliver of orange, joy, then froze when a surge of anger from another jar slammed into the tile. Heat washed the room. An eruption of bitter words leapt from the cluster. A clang of metal echoed. People flinched. Ari crossed the floor where damp footprints made small crescent moons. They did not try to reason with the noise. Instead, they breathed into the hollows beneath their ribs and let a melody form, small and plain, the kind of lullaby their grandmother might have hummed. It was not a performance. It was a hand placed on a fevered brow. The sound curved through the lab, a ribbon of wool that wrapped the laughter and softened it. The high peals thinned to amused chuckles, then to quiet, smiling exhalations. When a spike of anger, sharp as gravel, hit the lab's southeast quadrant. Ari tapped a steady rhythm on the nearest workstation. Palm, knuckle, palm. The pattern was unhurried, like a heartbeat recalling itself. The rhythm steadied eyes, slowed gestures, made clenched fists loosen. Samir, who had been hovering between exhilaration and panic, matched Ari's cadence with a spool of cable, rolling it in time like a drum. Lila lowered her clipboard and, for the first time, let a half-smile crease her face as she guided a colleague away from a jar that still shimmered. Soft words. Ari said to nobody and to everyone, and their voice blended with the music. They moved from jar to jar, cupping a swirl of fear with gentle syllables, humming to soothe a jar of grief until it settled like rain pooling in a dish. Each emotion cooled under their attention. Heat faded to ember, sharp edges dissolved. Hands reached in, steadying, patient, and together they closed the jars. Samir carried the heaviest ones, laughing low when one slipped into place, as if relieved to be trusted with something fragile. Lila signed off on the manifest, methodical even in tenderness. When the last stopper sealed, the lab felt smaller, safer, a cleared stage after a storm. Ari stood amid the quiet hum of machines, fingers still warm from the jars, and allowed themselves a brief, private smile. They had gathered the storm and, for now, held it close and calm. Ari lingered in the doorway of Lab 7, the glass still frosted where someone's hand had patted at the condensation. The room was a small tidal pool of humanity. Samir's bright laugh clipped at the edges of a sob from the control console. Dr. Lila's voice, usually iron, had softened into numbers and steps as she barked gentle orders. Seal the lids, check the seals, log each jar. For a moment the air felt too full, like a room stuffed with too many umbrellas opening at once. They reached for the jar without thinking. It was not ornate, no lattice of bronze or ribbon, just flattened glass that held a light like washed silk. The tag read peaceful in neat, faded ink. Ari had been saving it, folding their own small needs into its coolness, telling themselves they could wait. But the sound of Samir's breath hitching, the way Lila's jaw throbbed when she ground her teeth, traded patience for necessity. Ari crossed the lab and set the jar on the central table where the team gathered. The glass hummed faintly against the fluorescent hum, an almost inaudible chord that tugged the edges of the room taut and then let them ease. They did not announce what they were doing. Words thinned beneath the weight of feeling. Instead, Ari opened the jar with a practiced hand, the lid whispering away like a secret. The calm came like air after a storm. It slid along the bench, pooling in laps, finding shoulders and the hollow behind Samir's knees. The lab inhaled. Samir's shoulders unfolded, his laugh softening into an incredulous exhale, as if he'd been holding his chest closed to keep something in. Lila's shoulders dropped in a way Ari had never seen, less surrender than a measured release, and she leaned a palm against the table, eyes closing for a fraction of a beat that was everything. Ari felt the first wash of it on their own skin, warmth, the memory of childhood afternoons spent under a wide sky. Their heartbeat slowed, the tightness in their throat unwinding. Around them, conversations regained coherency. Samir reached out and squeezed Ari's hand, the gesture light and grateful, and mouthed thank you without making a sound that might shatter the fragile balance. But calm does not erase, it reshapes. Quiet threads wound through the lab, procedures resumed, checklists completed, the nearest jar inventories updated. Lila's voice returned, steadier, issuing one last instruction about containment protocols before allowing herself, impossibly, to laugh. It was short and bright and startled everyone into gentleness. Ari felt tired then, a pleasant ache spreading from their ribs outward, like a candle spent down to the wick. The last of the loud emotions folded into the hush. Relief, small and fierce, unfurled inside them. They imagined the jar darker now, its light diminished, but not gone, enough for this moment, enough to carry them all through the next swell. When the lab finally settled, Ari whispered into the quiet, not to anyone in particular, "We're okay." The words were true and fragile and enough. The lab smelled of sterilized air and lemon oil from a dish on the bench, an attempt at domesticity that clashed with the low mechanical hum of the servers. Dr. Lila Santos stood at the head of the table, palms flat on the laminated rule sheet they dragged into the open. For a moment she was all angle and precision, her voice cut through the room like glass. "Lockdown remains mandatory after a jar is registered," she read. "Two-person verification. Emotional release requires a certified guide." She lifted her head. "Add a cooling-off period. Any breaches trigger immediate containment protocols." Ari Bloom sat next to a stack of jars, fingers worrying the cap of one until the metal creaked. They had been the quiet bridge after the last incident, ferrying people back from panicked edges simply by sitting with them and handing over a hot mug. Now they watched Lila with an expression that was more hopeful than certain. "We should name the steps," Ari said softly, "so nobody has to guess what comes next." Samir leaned forward, the light catching the freckles on his nose. He sketched flowcharts with a marker until the dry erase squeaked. "Guides should be trained on emotional de-escalation," he said, breath quick. "And maybe," he stopped, looking for the right word, "scripts for the first 5 minutes. When someone opens a jar, we can't just wing it." Nell Gray folded her hands in her lap, the knitting she kept for nervousness tucked away. Her voice had the gravel of experience, but the warmth that soothed. "A checklist helps, but don't make it a sermon. People need to be heard, not processed." She tapped the laminated page. "And locks that show a progress light. A soft chime, something that tells you it's okay to breathe." They argued gently over language. Calming rooms versus debrief suites, guided openings versus therapeutic unsealing. Lila insisted on measurable safeguards, biometric logging, time locks, redundancy for failures, while Ari pushed for empathy checkpoints, a glance, a touch, the permission to step away. Samir suggested magnetic seals with manual overrides. Nell countered with a simple mechanical lock that any anxious hand could understand. At the far bench, they arranged prototypes, a jar rimmed with a soft LED that pulsed in warm amber, a pause button holster, an access card stamped with a tiny leaf. They mapped scenarios, panic on opening, laughter spilling forth, quiet sobs that didn't need fixing, only holding. Each plan carried the faint electricity of risk and care intertwined. When the meeting ended, the tension didn't evaporate. It transformed into something steadier. Lila took off her mask and, for the first time since the first lockdown order, let a small, exhausted laugh escape. She stepped close to Ari and, without protocol, offered her hand. Nell watched them, then met Ari's eyes. "Thank you," she said, voice thin with something like relief. She reached over, squeezing Ari's fingers. "You've helped me trust people again. Trust the work." Ari's cheeks warmed. They had been the one to sit with Nell through a long night. The gratitude lit their face more than any lamp. Outside, the rain clicked against the lab windows. Inside, the jars were secured, the rules rewritten, and the team had begun building safe ways to open what had been sealed. Care, they had decided, would be as engineered as the locks, deliberate, shared, and practiced, and that made the room feel both fragile and possible. Ari stood on tiptoe, fingers brushing the cool glass of the smallest jar. Its label, penciled in a careful hand, read Hope. For a long moment the shelf was only a row of bright reflections, emeralds of calm, amber pinches of memory, until he let the jar slide home. It made a tiny, precise click against the wood, like a soft punctuation mark. He smiled, a small, private thing that loosened the knots in his shoulders. "Good," Dr. Lila Santos said, folding her arms even though she was tired enough to let them tremble. Her voice kept the tightness of someone steering a large, fragile machine. One jar at a time, everything catalogued. Nell traced the edge of a label with a gnarled finger. "Names, dates, the feeling's intensity," she murmured, as if listing the ingredients for soup. Her eyes, a sediment of other people's stories, watched Ari with that impish patience she reserved for children and stubborn instruments. And a little ritual. People need a frame. They need to know the door will close again. They worked as the lab's fluorescent hum skated over their shoulders, lining jars, straightening labels, arranging the rows so each color eased into the next. The glass caught the overhead lights and fractured them into scratchings of warmth across the workbench. Lila tapped a tablet and drew a schedule, the blue of the screen reflecting in her spectacles. Times for guided openings were block scheduled. Mornings for grief, afternoons for relief, evenings for joy, each with a trained facilitator and a mandatory cooling period after. We'll verify physiological baselines before and after each opening, Lila said. Pulse, cortisol, the whole panel. No surprises. She did not sound unkind when she said, surprise, only disciplined. The room held its breath at the word, like someone holding a fragile note. Nell snapped a little laugh. I will hold people's hands if that's what it takes, she said, and there was steel beneath the softness. But if someone tries to take a jar out of session, no. I taught rules once to a dozen runaway daughters, and they stuck. Her gaze softened when it returned to Ari, who had just rearranged a half-dozen jars by color rather than by label, an old mediator's trick to make the room feel less clinical. They marked each jar with the time it could be opened and the name of the facilitator, then taped thin strips of paper with comforting phrases. Breathe, count, ask. Nell wrote, in looping script, the ink, a blot of kindness. Lila added calibration notes and check boxes, crisp and precise. Outside, the late light that had lived in the windows of the city all afternoon thinned to a pale band. The team exchanged looks that were neither triumphant nor wary, but ready, something steadier. Ari picked up the small jar he had returned and held it under his chin as though testing its weight around his throat. He slipped a folded scrap of paper inside, a single feeling he intended to keep, a quiet certainty that someone could be trusted again. As he stepped toward the door, the lab hummed with the soft evidence of order. Cups rinsed, lids tightened, lists completed. Nell reached out and touched his sleeve. Bring a lantern when they call you, she said, or come with one. He laughed, breath warm in the cooling corridor. He left with the jar's small weight against his ribs, its warmth a private ember. The lab behind him felt like a place where people learned and healed together, a place where new rules could stitch open things back into something that held. For the first time in a while, Ari believed he could carry one small feeling close and still return to do the work.